Good. I've got my voice today, so I'll be a little bit more animated. I'll try to talk as fast as possible since English is most people's second language. All right, so I want to set the scene today. The Ukraine Cyberattack, well, that was something you've undoubtedly heard about, and I most certainly don't want this to become the Stuxnet of the next 3 years, where it's heard at every single conference and we get tired of it. So I want to talk a little bit about some impacts that we observed after. So the first part of my talk, I'll cover the attack itself to make sure we're all on the same page. And the second part, I'll focus very heavily on some things that I thought we could have done better. Where were some areas for improvement? Not only maybe a little bit of the technical, but much more the geopolitical and sort of more strategic view of what happened. But again, I want to set the scene. It was about 1 year ago. We're talking a very cold December month. December, dead of winter. Now, there was an event that occurred, of course, that nobody believed would happen. Everyone talked about it, the possibility of it happening, but no one actually believed it. They were just stunned when it really happened. But I think it's important to note that it wasn't just that one day. It was months and months of planning. There's tons of planning that went into this. And of course, it was extremely expensive. So expensive that you might as well just been dripping with gold to actually achieve this thing. Now, of course, I'm talking about my wedding. It was hopefully the only time that'll ever occur in history. But I was very happy to have my wedding in December. And I set this sort of talk up this way because my wedding was December 25th. And it was very, very awkward that I get the phone call on December 23rd saying, hey, power's out in Ukraine. And I'm like, cool, click. Don't care. I'm getting married, guys, like, calm down. Then, of course, I get a call back on December 24th. I'm hanging out with my friends, getting ready, getting excited. Nobody would have ever thought I was going to get married, so I was totally excited. And I get the phone call and say, no, seriously, the Ukrainians came out and said it was Russia. Attribution's not done in a day. Click. And so I hung up again. And finally, about 2 hours before my wedding, I got a call from some very knowledgeable people to say, you know what, this is actually real, and we're putting together a team to analyze it remotely. There's some people on site doing some good work, some instant responders, but we're going to give you access to some data and start looking at what actually happened. I was like, I'm going to go ahead and finish up this whole wedding thing, and I'm hoping that she'll be here when I get back. And she is. That's good. We're actually finally going to be able to go on our honeymoon in 2 days. I leave here from a little bit cold Stockholm, and I'm going to New Zealand, which will be a little bit more warm. So I feel bad for me. It's going to be horrible. But let's look at the actual attack. So first up, just for anybody that hasn't had the pleasure of being a very weird electric power person in their life, power grids and electric grids, to be specific, they have a number of different functionality to them. And Erwin will hopefully correct me if I get anything wrong, but let's just keep it to the very basic fact that there's usually 3 components, right? So generation, transmission, and distribution. And the reason I structure this out this way is because for the last 30 years or so, people have been talking about critical infrastructure security. Probably more than that, but really public for about the last 30 years. And rightfully so, where investments have been prioritized has been on generation and transmission. If you wanted to do a lot of damage to an electric grid, that's where you would target. So it made sense that it would also be a nation-state target, that if we had extremists or if we had nation-states targeting the power grid, that it would be at the generation of electricity or it'd be at the transmission of bulk electric grid. Everything that happened to Ukraine happened at the distribution level. So that was really interesting for a lot of folks because it depends on where you are in the world, but especially in the US, a lot of distribution sites, if they have been secured and if they have been taken care of, it's almost out of the goodness of the company's heart or just because they want to be consistent across their infrastructure. But there's no actual requirement to secure that. So when we talk about things in the US like NERC-CIP and the regulations they have for critical infrastructure, it's really only applicable to what crosses state lines. It's only federal. So it's transmission and generation. It's not distribution. One of the things that I'll highlight as an after-the-fact lesson is for months following the attack, I thought I was going to have to de-hype it. Because I de-hype a lot of articles. I hear all these sort of hyped up stories, and I love pushing back against the myths. And I really thought I was going to have to de-hype the Ukraine attack. And I was shocked to find that for months after the attack, government officials around the world, especially in the US, came out and said, oh, don't worry, this can't happen here. Like, what? What do you mean it can't happen? We're not even doing much for the distribution grid. And the response I got was, no, we have NERC CIP. Well, NERC CIP as a regulation, it has helped the industry some. There depends on who you ask, very pros and a lot of cons for some people. It's very expensive, but it only applies to generation and transmission, not distribution. How possibly could NERC CIP protect us from a distribution attack? Also, the assumption that a box on the network or regulations are going to stop an adversary is very silly. They're going to look at the regulation, they're going to read what your regulation is, and they're going to design their attack around the regulations because you've told them what your defenses are. So the assumption that regulation would stop this style of attack, it was very difficult to actually push against national level leaders in the media and say, actually, the Undersecretary of the Department of Energy, the congressional members, the House committee, they're wrong. And that's a very weird stance to take. But let's look at this really quickly. So in Ukraine, it was 3 different Oblenergos that were targeted. And you may have read the report already. I put out a report earlier this year with Mike Asante and Tim Roxy and Tim Conway over a mixed report between SANS and the ISAC. And we just took a look at what happened and structured it out against the two-stage ICS cyber kill chain. The first part of it shocked no one. It was exactly like you would expect, right? Spearfishing email gets delivered, it's weaponized in the sense that there's malicious Word documents, malicious Office documents, and they asked users basically, hey, do you want extra features? If so, click enable on the macros. And people were like, I totally want extra features, click. And of course, Black Energy 3 then dropped to the system. Now, what wasn't covered so clearly that I think is important to note is if you were doing the traditional things of let me search for an indicator of compromise and block it or stop it and be done with it, you would have missed the real campaign that was unfolding. In essence, what happened is after Black Energy 3 was on the network, and when it got to the actions phase of stage 1, the adversaries were pulling off legitimate accounts. They're pulling off legitimate credentials. And in a couple of days after infecting the sites, they moved over to what I would call living on the land. They started using legitimate accounts and credentials. So actually, there were some other Oblenergos that didn't make the news, that weren't power outages occurred, but were still infected and still impacted, and they thought they had already cleaned it. They actually saw the Black Energy infections. They went back after the fact and used IOCs and said, boom, got it, nailed it, done. And they missed all of the actual adversary activity that was unfolding using legitimate accounts. So it's not about finding individual technical indicators, it's about understanding the adversary and understanding your landscape. When it gets down to the stage 2, this is where I think it gets kind of more interesting for us in the ICS community. So what they did for development, they did a couple things. Besides malware, I want to move away from the malware. The human threat was responsible. It wasn't malware that brought down the power grid. So what they developed in my mindset is 2 things. First of all, they developed knowledge on the systems. So there's 3 different distribution management systems used at the 3 different Oblenergos. So one was a Russian-based company, one was a Ukrainian-based company, and one was a company that you'd find around the Western world. And they learned how to use these distribution management systems. Now, this is not some feat that is impossible to achieve. Looking at an HMI and figuring out how to disconnect substations in of itself is not super difficult. But they still developed that knowledge, and I'll come to a point on how we know they were at least a little bit smart in what they were doing. The other thing I'll say that they developed and tested was firmware for the serial to Ethernet converters. So serial Ethernet converter sitting between a control center and a substation, what sends the IP communication to the substation, converts it to serial, and uses it. They found about 30 of those, and they developed firmware for those devices. Now, there's been some debate in the community on how specific or how custom or how tailored the firmware was. I don't know that it particularly matters. It worked. It was advanced enough. But I'll note that what's interesting to me is I know they tested it. And this is not fact. This is not an assessment. This is just pure speculation. But in my gut, I'm comfortable with saying they tested it. Because for anybody that's ever done a firmware update to a control system, Like if we ask the audience, and because we're extremely talkative here, I'm not going to, but if we ask the audience on if you've ever done a control system update, physically connected to the control system and did a firmware update, and most people would say yes because we're extremely all technical here, but how many times has it failed? We'd get a range of answers, but probably like 20 to 30% of the time, it just fails. Sometimes it just fails, and you just reset it, and it's okay. Like, it holds it in memory, you wipe it out of memory, you try again. Across the 30-something serial to Ethernet converters, they had a 100% success ratio remotely. No way they didn't test that. So I've got zero evidence to say the adversary was testing it out somewhere. I've got zero evidence to put any fact to this, but just Rob Lee's speculation as they tested this somewhere. Could have been on their own infrastructure, could have broken into other facilities as well. So don't just assume testing is going to take place by someone buying an asset. That can be interesting. There might be a supply chain aspect. You want to monitor where it goes. But it can also be that adversaries are breaking into locations around the world and using your ICS as a very expensive test bed. Why not? It costs $20 million to set up a nice little test facility. Why not just use some small substation that's not monitoring their environment? Anyways, when it came time for the delivery stage, they remote desktoped out the environment. So the HMIs had remote desktop assistance enabled on them. And they just used the legitimate VPNs in the environment and used legitimate remote desktop assistants to be able to remote out those HMIs. When it came time for the attack, they also had kill disk positioned around the environment. I imagine in the next presentation we'll go into more of the technical details of that. But they pre-positioned kill disk around the environment, and in some locations, it was set to trigger upon reboot. So upon reboot of the system, that's when it would actually wipe off files or write over the master boot record. They also found a network-connected UPS. If you wanted to reboot a bunch of systems, how convenient. So they found a network-connected UPS, and they said, hey, let's schedule a load shed that when the power goes out, we'll go ahead and drop the power and bring the power back up and then drop the power again, thus restarting all the systems and activating kill disk, wiping all the Windows systems. And we'll go ahead and say that we'll drop the network interface card so people can't go back into the UPS. Came time for the attack, click, 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 going down. First facility, very quickly. Second facility, about a minute later. Third Oberlin Ergo, about 30 minutes later. All in all, they disconnected around 225,000 customers from the grid, 3 different regions. Now, that's not a ton. 225,000 customers, I would say like one hotel could be a customer, so not 225,000 people. But it's not a lot. We have these events before, right? And the outages only lasted about 3 to 6 hours. So people really thought, well, maybe this wasn't a big deal, but I'll get to why I think it's a big deal afterwards. But just to top it all off, they also launched a telephone denial of service against the call centers at the end. Like, why not at that point? So if you're the operator, you're looking at the screen, mouse starts moving. There was even one of them that took a camera out and was like, hey, this isn't me. Like, let me record this real quick. And you can see the mouse moving. If you're the operator, this is very, very quick. It's all happening like 3:30 in the afternoon because nothing ever happens in the morning when it's convenient, right? And very quickly, within 32, 33 minutes, the whole thing's over. Not a lot of time to do defense. But what I want to stress is all of this started 6 to 7 to 8 months, really about 6 months in these environments before this. So there was half a year that the adversary was operating in the environment. It's not so easy, even on a small-term disruption, to take down systems. You can find a system and nmap it and take it down, but really to affect the physical process, to really affect things like power in a constructed way that's actually an achievable goal, takes a little bit of insight and knowledge and discovery and operation. So about 6 months. Now, I imagine there'll be more discussion on this, but from my understanding and from my looking at data and timing and disconnect commands and the logs, I would say that if I was going to do this style of attack, which I would never do that, that's wrong, that's bad, but if I was going to do this style of attack, and from what I saw on the commands that were given, the timing, I would say there was about 20 people involved in this. So this was not some script kiddie in a basement. And I always love that too. People in the news media being like talking to a reporter, and they'll be like, well, I could have done that. And it's like, well, you didn't. There was about 20 people involved. Yeah, well, I could hop through an IP address from Korea to North Korea, back to South Korea, and through China, and then into Russia. It's not that simple. There's a lot that goes into this. Anyways, so that occurred. From the technical standpoint, there's a lot of lessons learned. We won't have to go through all these, but we can take any such model. This is one of the models that I usually teach out, the active cyber defense cycle. I will admit to you that I only threw the word cyber in there because it makes the acronym ACDC, and I just thought that was super clever. But the idea of consuming intelligence, finding what's on your network, monitoring your environment, doing better incident response because you know what's in your environment, and then doing threat analysis. Not getting stuck on malware analysis, but threat analysis. Threats have a combination of intent, opportunity, and capability. Malware is just one of those three things. It's the capability. So you have to do real threat analysis. And then from the threat intelligence that you actually generate internally, now you're sharing stuff with the community that's actually meaningful and not IP addresses. It's the how do we do defense. I mean, even from just the VPN session links into the environment, if you're doing nothing more than monitoring VPN session links, you should have identified in this environment, wow, normal VPN usage is a couple hours at a time as engineers remote in. The adversary is remoting in for 5 minutes at a time, checking the network and disconnecting and coming back multiple times. That's super abnormal. That's a weird pattern that is involved in the network. The other thing that I want to point out as a technical takeaway is a cyber defensible position. Yeah, all right. So, in my opinion, when we look at industrial control system environments, as Erwin and others have noted throughout the conference, integration's coming, right? Convergence is happening. The boardroom is pushing iPads in the control centers with HMIs. Just get over it. It sucks. We all wish it wasn't happening. But what are we going to do about it is the result, not can we push against it. You're not going to win the board discussion. So one of the things I think in the ICS community, though, we should get in a habit of doing is having a cyber defensible position. And you don't have to use the word cyber if you don't want to, but defensible position. What I like about a defensible position is saying, fine, we have to have iPads. Fine, we have to have remote access and HMI access. Fine, we have to have remote vendor access on ports that we aren't using. But if we ever have a heightened sense of awareness, or if Oblanergo 1 ever goes out and Oblanergo 2 goes out, at Oblanergo 3, can we go ahead and disconnect from the internet? Can we go ahead and get ourselves into a more hardened situation where we no longer allow access to the iPads? And we've pre-coordinated with engineering and ops that they can still do their work without that access. And then once the situation has resolved itself, we can move back into normal operations. At worst, even if the adversary just waited, at worst, you've significantly delayed them, and it can start getting at your understanding of what the real operation is. All right, so let's look at the takeaways. Couldn't get through a presentation without Little Bobby, so here's one. First of all, Little Bobby says, hey, do advanced threats always use zero-day exploit code and cool tactics? And Matt says, no, there's no value in doing cool things if the basics work. And Little Bobby reminds us, yeah, maybe there's no bonus points for looking good in the threat intel report. And I'll give you a very maybe harsh statement. As I noted previously, I spent most of my career on defense because I thought defense was just way cooler. For a time, and I know this is going to be hard to believe, but in the government, you always don't get to choose your job. And for a time, I had to do offense for about 1.5 years, and then I got out because I hated offense. But for a while, when I was on an offense team and I was somebody's APT, no time during any of the discussions on a day-to-day basis, sitting down, preparing for operations, and getting ready to do things, did the thought process ever cross any of our minds of, hey, if the defenders find us, how are we going to impress them? Like, how do we make this look cool for them? Like, no, that's not the concern. The concern is, I've got 30 other things to do today. How do we get in and on with our life? How do we do it in a way that doesn't alert everybody? If they find your basic piece of malware, maybe they won't call all the experts in. But if they find some really cool piece of malware, it's going to be a big threat intelligence report. So there's actually a lot of benefit to being basic. And I bring this up because in the Ukraine attack, I saw a lot of people post-Ukraine saying, well, 3 to 6 hours power outage, not a big deal. So let's explore some of these takeaways a year later. First of all is on the information sharing piece. That's a big discussion point, and I'm a huge fan of it when it's done correctly. But there were some challenges when it came to the Ukraine scenario. Nobody in the United States community, and so that's all I'll speak about here today is my view from the US community perspective. But nobody on the US perspective had an incident response plan for a power outage in Ukraine. And I think that's totally fine. It's not like the ICS CERT and the US government should have an incident response plan for some other nation's power grid going down. But you should have a communication plan. And so this is a takeaway for everybody. Regardless of what's going to happen, if it's a big deal to your audience, it's a big deal. How are you going to communicate about it? And what we found is in the government communities, as they tried to share to the private sector, they call these big fancy meetings. They said, hey, let's have this big roundtable meetings And we'll invite the community and tell them what we know currently, which is exciting. That's exactly what we want to see. But they classified the hell out of everything, which made it totally not usable. Because what happened is they used the classification, maybe not intentionally, but they used the classification standards to keep people out of the meetings. What I mean by that is nothing that was ever briefed in any of the classified meetings was classified. The meetings were classified. All the slides were unclassified. All the discussions were unclassified. There was no requirement to have security clearances or anything. But you had to have a security clearance to get in. So unintentionally, at best, it was used to keep people from talking about something that people needed to be talking about. And so one of my takeaways would be, you don't have to have the right answer to every event that unfolds, but you must have a communication plan about how you're going to effectively disseminate information in the community in a way that actually allows them to use it. Right now, there's some very big discussions in the US community around the fact that CEOs of large power companies have had to pay a lot of money to get their people's security clearances to only go into meetings that are unclassified. That's a waste of their money. Every stock payer inside that company should be really upset. Oh, and by the way, in those classified meetings, what they were briefing wasn't government knowledge. Everyone always thinks like government knows everything on the classified piece, but then we get to elections and we're like, governments know nothing, and somehow we expect those things to go together. Nothing that they were briefing was actually specific to the government. It was actually the report analysis that ECIT, that SANS, that everyone else was doing. That's all that got briefed. So people got called in to get a brief that they could have seen on a website, but because the meeting's now classified, they can't talk about it. That's not good. The other sort of lesson learned was around improper information sharing, realistically. So when the government teams actually got to go over to Ukraine, so when the Ukrainian government said, hey, we would like to see the United States Department of Homeland Security come in, I thought the ICS CERT and the people that went on the trip, 99.9% of them were awesome, professional, did a really good job. That 0.1% didn't mean to be an idiot, but was an idiot. There's no nice way to say it. So because the US didn't have a response plan and didn't really sort of get it together early on and how to go, everybody that was doing the analysis finished like a month earlier. So ECIT's analysis, SOC Prime, the SANS analysis, everybody had pretty much concluded everything there was to know in the beginning of January. So by the time the teams got there mid to late January, the Ukrainians were super proud. They were like, hey, look at this PowerPoint. We've made it for you. Here it is with all of our sensitive internal IP ranges, all the digital hashes, all the information about the adversary, everything you'd want to know. Isn't that awesome? Here you go, US. And one of the people on the team who was inexperienced and probably shouldn't have been on the team said, Black Energy 3 is distributed via Office documents. PowerPoint is an Office document. Ukrainians are infected. I better upload this to VirusTotal to make sure it's not infected. Within 5 minutes, every security company worth their salt who has access to everything that gets submitted to VirusTotal and got access to all these sensitive incident response details, all the sensitive hashes, all the IP ranges, everything. And that means their adversary did too. So the adversary gets this nice playbook of saying, oh, here's all what the Ukrainians did. Isn't that cool? So we will restrict certain types of information sharing and then just be really frivolous with other types of information sharing. And actually, all the leaks to come out about the Ukraine attack weren't leaks from the researchers, weren't leaks from people that were talking inappropriately. It was government officials who got briefed on something and thought it was cool, and so they talked to reporters. And that's not a US problem. That's an everywhere in the world problem. We see that everywhere. So yeah, that was kind of awkward, right? To be that guy. They actually had to have him leave the country. Like if you screw up so badly on incident response that one ambassador is calling another country's ambassador to apologize, you screwed up. Like there's no nice way to say that. Now, the other thing that delayed, and this is another lesson learned, and this is not a bash the US government presentation, although that would be fun sometimes. I actually think the people there are really, really passionate, extremely knowledgeable, but bureaucracy gets in the way, and I hate bureaucracy. So I'd like to talk about where that can hinder these response plans for nations. So one of the bureaucratical processes that hindered it is the timeline to release. So if you look at the timeline, ECIT started putting out blogs, SANS came out January 1st and said something about it. We confirmed the cyber attack by January 9th. A lot of good public information was out there. The government's first public response at all was February 24th. 2 months and 1 day after the attack was the first time they came out and said, ICS community, from the ICS CERT, did you know there was a cyber attack in Ukraine? That's all they said. There was a cyber attack in Ukraine. Also, they said, we do not have reason to believe that Black Energy 3 was involved. So a lot of people thought, oh, well, all the reporting is wrong. But when you talk to the ICS CERT, they'll gladly tell you that they're required to make that statement because they never looked at technical data. So they never had access to the forensics, they never had access to the malware samples, they never had access to anything. So they're technically required to say, we found no evidence because they didn't look. But it tells the community, oh, I guess the ICS CERT looked and then found nothing. So maybe a little bit of wrong conclusion there. But the real reason for the entire delay around the report is they were arguing for over a month at the White House level, National Security Council, and the senior level of the Department of Homeland Security about the definition of a cyber attack. I'll let that sit in for a second. So the delay of 2 months and a day to tell their national audience that a cyber attack occurred by a group that had previously targeted the US power grid, an imminent potential threat, was because they were arguing over whether or not they could get away with not calling it a cyber attack. Well, maybe we could just call it a cyber intrusion. Do we really have to use the word attack? And I've already FOIA'd the document because I really just want to show people, but I'm go ahead and say it here, and it's completely profane and vulgar, and I apologize, but I'm for historical purposes. At one point, someone in the ICS CERT, again, the ICS CERT people themselves, fantastic, responded back to the senior level leadership and said, well, if that's not a cyber attack, why the fuck are we here? And I think that speaks to the really bent up aggression and sort of discontent inside the government channels about trying to push the information out. So it's not like there's one big group just not releasing information. So in other words, at least have definitions before the attack occurs, right? Actually know what you're going to be speaking about and having an understanding of what terminology you're going to use to the community, even if you don't know the event that is going to happen. Now, the other thing I saw is we don't generally get a lot of incident response data from IT companies. Like if JP Morgan or SAP or some other big company gets breached, it's not like they release their incident response reports to everybody and say, hey, here's everything that we know. They might have to release, like they might be obligated to release some sort of after action report. They don't really release all the technical details though. I was actually extremely impressed with how much information was released with Ukraine. The Ukrainians were very proactive and said, yes, the world needs to know, give out this information, which I thought was really awesome. And so this is my one almost critique to the larger community, is after we gave out as much information as possible, there was a lot of people in the community that said, we want more, 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 I need proof. Well, we're not trying to prove it to you, we're trying to say, here's what happened, use it as you want or not. But we had a lot of people come to me afterwards, since my name was associated with quite a bit, and said, oh wow, I bet this is like some sort of false flag operation, and the Ukrainians just attacked themselves, and I can't prove that this was actually a cyber attack. And it's like, okay man, like you do you, but the rest of the community is gonna focus on some of these issues. And I would have to say that there was a certain sense of the responders saying, look, we've done everything we can to make everything publicly available. Now, most people actually used it very correctly. I was impressed that at the strategic level, a lot of the politicians didn't get a lot of their game together. But at the asset owner community, I saw asset owners and infrastructure sites around the world, not just in the electric industry, take these use cases and start leveraging them to make their infrastructure better, to raise awareness, to have a discussion with their board of directors about why they need these plans. So I actually thought the ICS community itself was really, really mature in how it responded. And when it came down to measuring impact, that's what most of them did. They said, okay, cool. Forget what caused the outage. If we were going to have this style of effect here, what would we have done about it? How would we communicate to our customers that a power is out? If the telephone system is down and customers can't call in to figure out why the power is down, how do we communicate to them? How do we put these response plans together in a constructive way? That's what I thought was really useful. And the same thing when we look at the overall events, I saw some pundits come out and say, well, a nation state did this, which was never proved. We'll talk about, maybe in the next presentation, we'll talk about the basis of the team, but there was no direct tie to a nation state proven. But a lot of pundits came out and said, well, if this is all they can do, then who cares? You cannot take what occurred. You can't take the view of the impact and assume that that is what the adversary intended to do. From my viewing of the forensics data, from my view of what happened, it very much looked like to me that the adversary pulled back a little, that there was a reason, for some reason, not to do as much damage as they could have done. They were in lots of other locations. They just specifically targeted 3. Why those 3? Mike Asante actually had a good theory around this, which I think is a pretty solid one. But if you look at the automation of the grid and where the central locations are for modernized systems, those 3 Olbonergos were the most modernized systems. They were actually the best targets for this style of attack. Not the most the adversary could achieve, but this style of attack. So when it comes to, and this obviously is not Ukraine, this is a substation that was flooded out. My point is, we have events in the community where there's 3 to 6 hour power outages. I mean, that happens. We have a very good ICS engineer, operator, tech community that responds to these type of things. They get out there, they do their job, they flip circuits, they go with the breakers. I mean, they do everything possible to restore the power. And that's what happened to Ukraine. The reason it was 3 to 6 hours was not because the adversary wasn't good enough. The reason it was 3 to 6 hours is because the Ukrainian operators and engineers were really good about going back, finding the distribution trucks, driving out to the stations, and going back into manual operations. They didn't have to rely on SCADA so much because they haven't had SCADA for as long as everyone else. They are a recently modernized grid for the last decade or so they still had people in their workforce that knew how to go back to manual operations. My question to you all, though, is if you had those type of outages, what is the ability for you to go back to manual operations? The people that really know how to do it are getting a little salt and peppery in the beard. We're not bringing in the people in the workforce that could really do that. And as we move on, it is my concern about if we can go back to manual operations across multiple regions of a grid. I know in the United States, it's not that easy. I think it would have been harder to take us down to begin with. We would have had a much longer recovery effort than what the Ukrainians were able to achieve. So we may have seen a lot of politicians and individuals and others say, hey, we're going to ignore this. We're going to move away from this. And like I said, for the first couple months, we argued against the political scene. About 3 or 4 months after, when all these CEOs of companies were saying, hey, this is a really big deal, finally the government came out like, oh yeah, it's totally a big deal, and we were telling you all along that we need to take a serious effort against this. But I do want to sort of leave the communication as I start wrapping up and say, I was really, really impressed with Ukraine on this one. We can all have conversations about what we would have done differently, how we would have responded differently, and I hope all of you use the case study, use the report to raise awareness and talk about how you'd respond. But how the Ukrainians responded was actually world-class. They did as much as they could. They called in outside experts. They called in security companies. They had people outside of their nation take a look at it so it didn't appear too biased. They were comfortable sharing details to the larger community. I mean, in all, after getting just knocked out flat, and really think about that, when you have power go out in the middle of December, we may understand that, but does Granny Smith, does Papa Joe, or whatever the Swedish equivalents are? Anyways, would they understand what was going on? Or would they be scared in their homes and feel like they just got the wind knocked out of them? But somebody was just able to turn off the lights remotely? But the Ukrainians, they took their breath back, right? They called in those teams, and in my opinion, they stood up to the adversary in a very significant way. And I agree with Erwin in the sense that I think whoever did this attack, some Russian-based team, whoever did the attack out of that construct, in my opinion, lost out in a very big way. We don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but in the end, it was actually a really interesting global effort, a global sharing, and a really good response from Ukraine that I think all of us could cheer for in the end. All right, so with that, I will close up my session. I left it with a little Bobby full of hope thing. I like optimism. Defense is doable. Don't get down about the attackers. They're not as good as everyone thinks they are. But I think now we're actually going to get up the next presentation. I think we're skipping questions because we have a panel coming up right after the next presentation. So this is sort of the higher level view of Ukraine. Rob and Anton are going to come up and give the more technical view of the Black Energy campaign itself and the malware analysis. And then we're going to all come back up on the stage and do a Q&A around the entire session now that you sort of have the larger view and answer some of those questions that you might have had. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and go.
Thank you.